Well, Chief of Air Force, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Energy security. If we don't have it, everything the Chief said this morning about our 5th Gen force will not work. It is that fundamental. Without this, without resilient supply chains, we will not be able to operate, and our support infrastructure won't either. Now, when you start these things, you're supposed to quote some air power theorist. I'm going to quote an old friend of mine, Group Captain Doc Miller. Well, he's a sort of air power theorist. This is what he wrote in a brief to Jeff Brown when he was chief, and it seems really obvious. You know, government and the Australian population expects defence to operate when markets fail. We're not just there for fair weather. But you would not believe how this fundamental thought is fundamentally ignored in our approach to energy security in this country. So I'd like you to think about that as I talk, but I'd also like you to think about this other issue. National security depends on energy security. Again, it's a blindingly obvious statement, but the energy industry here says it's not appropriate to connect the two of them. We have to keep them as separate issues. Now, what's happening in the world? We're undergoing a major energy transformation, and not just in the energy sector, because it's completely linked with other issues. Climate change is going to have a significant effect, and Admiral Morissetti will be going into much greater depth on this when he speaks after me. It's going to affect our supply chains. It's going to affect security eventually. But more importantly, if we continue to grow economies and we grow populations and we grow our energy consumption, because GDP growth and energy consumption are pretty closely matched as they grow, by 2050 we'll have somewhere between 50 or 100% more energy consumption. We can't afford to use the types and mix of energy that we do today in 2050 because we will poison ourselves. The other issue is economic change. The transition in energy is going to cost money. Shell's study says there's about $55 trillion worth of infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure in the developed world. So as we transition to a different energy mix, where's the money going to come from, particularly with stagnant economies? The other economic change that's going to really hit on a politics level is that energy prices for East Coast consumers in Australia went up 12% last year, 6 times the average pay rise. Now, that's a near-term political problem for people that have to be addressed. Technology changes will afford great opportunities for us if they're applied intelligently, and I will argue they're not being done that way, and we'll see changes in consumer behaviour and market reform. So what we've got is this incredible spiral area that we're going to have to navigate. The question is can defence and our nation get secure and resilient energy supplies as we go through this transition over the next few decades? Now, energy issues are so intertwined with other security developments, defence forces cannot ignore them. But it's not just about fuel stocks. When I talk to politicians, how many days of stocks have we got in defence? It's far more complicated than that. Because even if you double the stocks, if the interruption lasts longer than a period, you're still stuffed. The other thing is to paraphrase Professor Ken Baldwin from the Australian National University. He runs the Energy Change Institute. He says that defence organisations must understand this ongoing change and transformation in energy. The complex interactions between energy and geopolitics, as the ambassador spoke about this morning, that's fundamental understanding, not only for the job in terms of military operations, but understanding how the world works. Foreign investment and ownership of supply chains is a critical issue for us to understand. We have to understand energy and cyber attack, energy and resilience in the face of climate change. And we've got to really balance some of the short-term issues with the longer-term opportunities. NATO, a couple of years ago, put up these 3 things that they were focusing on. I'm going to talk briefly about 2 approaches in the US military and one in the US think tank that I think are excellent examples of how we should be addressing energy security. The US 26 Operational Energy Strategy talks about increasing warfighting capability by including energy throughout force development. I can tell you as a defence consultant working out in industry, I see proposals coming out the door and they could have been written in the 1990s as far as energy discussion goes in them. They want to reduce logistics and operational risks from operational energy vulnerabilities, so we need to understand it. This think tank, which is the Energy Security Leadership Council, is fairly impressive in the US. There's a whole bunch of retired generals and admirals on there, but a lot of existing business leaders. And what they've said is, look, this market-driven approach is the best way to approach our economic challenges. But there are some things you cannot leave to the market alone. The example they talk about is oil. And where foreign governments can control or influence your energy supplies, only government action can address those threats to your energy security. It's a pretty fundamental point. So where do we look for our energy security and what the government policies are? Well, the last paper was the 2015 Energy White Paper. And when you read it, it's actually quite good. We're a growing energy superpower. We are actually the 9th largest energy producer in the world. We're endowed with vast energy resources, which they said will give us low-cost energy. I don't think it's quite worked out that way when you see what our cost prices are. It talks about our guiding principle should be about leaving it to the market to operate freely without unnecessary government intervention. In fact, most of the Energy White Paper is about making sure the markets work effectively without government interference. And it does talk about the government will monitor energy security through a National Energy Security Assessment. And it was due to be published in 2015. Well, it didn't come out in 2015. It didn't come out in 2016. It didn't come out in 2017. And if it comes out this year, it'll be a miracle. So the only energy security assessment we have was done in 2011. The world has changed significantly in the last 6 years. And that energy security assessment, I have argued repeatedly in public, was fundamentally flawed. It didn't look at any of the scenarios, for example, we would look at in defence to justify the $30 billion a year that we spend in the defence of our nation. So in other words, we've worked out the technical and platform things we need to do, but the energy security assessment doesn't look at any of those scenarios. I'll back later. So where do we stand within defence about our policy and approach to this? Well, a logical place to start would be the Defence White Paper from 2016. But there's nothing in it about energy security. It talks about remediating problems in defence's fuel infrastructure, largely IH&S and resiliency problem, but it doesn't address it. When I look around defence, there are very good developments across defence services, defence sciences, but in piece parts. Army looking at deployable power. Navy's got wave generation on the West Coast. Air Force has talked about some solar areas. Some good innovations are happening with the Innovation Hub. But that's all I could see. The Defence Estate Energy Strategy is pretty good. But it looks at identifying energy consumption needs, changing behaviours, efficiency, some renewables, and it does mention the need to look at resiliency of power supplies, for example, to our bases. But it can't affect any change from where it stands. I was very impressed in 2016 when the Defence magazine published this about the Defence Energy Integration Framework. It recognised the large amounts of energy and the dependence we have on fuel supply lines. Now I'm talking, it's not just about fuel, it's electricity, gas, fuel, renewables, everything that we have in the country. It recognised the challenges and the vulnerabilities of them, and the aim of this framework was to ensure delivery of sustainable energy for operations both now and the long term. Very enthused at looking at it. So since 2016, what's happened? It's faded from view. Folks tell me inside the organisation that it was never resourced. Now, that's not unusual, as we know. Some of our change processes start out, but we don't resource them. And that's disappeared. So as of today, as far as I'm aware, well, certainly as of December, there is no defence operational energy strategy. So let's go back to what the Americans are doing right now. There is no defence operational energy policy. And I can't work out who's got the lead. This is not something you chuck to CJ Log and say, well, the loggies take care of the enablers. This is a fundamental national security issue. Now, I've had a talk to CJ Log about this, and I admire the job they're doing, but it's not his job. This is a much bigger issue. So, what do people outside of Australia think about us? The International Energy Agency, we're one of 29 member countries, published their review of Australia's energy policies last month. And this is what they said. Whilst we're endowed with natural resources, there are energy security risks across several sectors that have increased. The signs of the Australian energy system are showing signs of stress. The energy policy governance in Australia is very complex and fragmented. They also tell us that we're increasingly exposed to new challenges for maintaining security of supply, and if we'd had proper monitoring, analysis and planning, these issues they're now seeing could have been signalled earlier and remedies could have been applied. That's a slightly different picture than when you read the Energy White Paper. They do go on to say we do need a NESA. That's fairly obvious. They then tell us that we're the only IEA member country which is a net more oil importer. We import 90% of our transport fuels, that solely relies on commercial stock holdings for the industry to meet our obligations. It also notes that we're, as an IEA member country, unable to meet any of the two main obligations we have as a member. That's a certain level of stock holdings and the ability to contribute to the release of stocks to the market in the event of a supply disruption that happened back in the 70s. It also said our country's oil stocks are at an all-time low, with having no strategic oil stocks at all and not placing any stock holding obligations on industry. We're quite unique compared to developed countries. Most of them actually do this. Now, when I've been talking to politicians about this, they say, well, if we run into a problem, we'll go down to the nearest defence base and we'll access their stocks. I had to inform them that we don't have strategic stocks, and they were quite in shock. So, they tell us our policies in the oil sector, for example, about efficient, flexible markets. They're unregulated and business as usual. But when do you shift from business as usual to conflict? I'd argue we're in conflict now for some reasons I'll cover later. They also say that our focus on ensuring the oil market operates efficiently and flexible is a good idea. But here's the rub. The IEA then told us this. It is less clear how we in Australia would respond in the event of a serious oil supply disruption leading to market failure. I ask you, do we have a secure and resilient energy system? Now, these guys aren't amateurs. They, not only for IEA member countries, spent a lot of time analysing energy security around the world. Let's step back to the white paper. The 2015 Energy White Paper didn't refer, for example, to electricity supply security. If you step back to the 2011 NESA, it did. And it said, hey, we're going to get improved reliability of our electricity supply as current infrastructure investments replace ageing network infrastructure. But it also said it's not the government's job to do that, that's the market's job. Well, what happened? For the benefit of our foreign visitors, back in 2016, we saw ourselves confronted with a statewide electricity blackout in South Australia. It was a systems failure. It's like rolling a bowling ball to a set of pins. Things started to fail, it cascaded. In the end, it disconnected the South Australian and Victorian power supply connections. That was apparently a non-credible scenario when it was considered before it happened. This led to a huge reaction, mainly political fights and blame sharing, and the Finkel review, which looked at electricity markets and a little bit of the gas markets. Because, as you may or may not be aware, the electricity market can't operate without gas. They've created an energy security board to look at the security of the system. There is no defence representation on it. I've got to tell you, defence and parts of AGD, in my view, are the two areas that actually do understand security rather than just the market forces and should be included. The IEA, when they did their assessment of this, said, and I'm paraphrasing here, there's significant design weaknesses in the electricity networks and systems, because it's all been done in pieces, that can lead to power system disruptions. Well, it did, and we could be there again. We've got similar problems in Tasmania. I think the Sunday Age came up with the best analysis of our power failures in South Australia that I've seen. And if you are working in defence and you look under your desk, you'll probably see something like this. And you do know from experience that when you kick out in frustration and kick one of these plugs out, things happen that are not good. And sticking another plug on the top called the Snowy Booster, which the Australians will know what that is not going to make much difference. Let's leave that aside. So why, as our previous speaker said, I'm also a retired pensioner. Why am I bothering with this sort of stuff and talking about it? Well, after I left the Air Force full-time service in 2008, I got involved with a series of think tanks and studies. One of the first ones I did, along with Dr. Gary Waters, who's floating around here somewhere, was to look at our cyber security challenge in Australia. I was at one point responsible for cyber policy and defence. I actually thought I knew a fair bit about it. But as I started to look at the broader national infrastructure, the assumptions I'd made about the resiliency of systems were done through a defence viewpoint. They were false. My assumptions were fundamentally wrong. The fragility that I saw in this, that Gary and I saw, of our national infrastructure and our supply chains worried us. Here is this AusCERT report that came out looking at the vulnerabilities and attacks on our systems in Australia. Energy is the big red piece at the top there. At their report, it said the energy and comm sectors had the highest number of compromised systems, and the energy sector is one of the ones with the highest number of malicious emails. Now, it's not just an issue of ownership, but only half of our energy companies are actually wholly Australian owned. But there is something going on here, and the resilience of it is a problem. If we don't have an electricity system, our bases don't operate, our support entities in this country don't operate, we can't deploy. Just look at the news in the last week from the UK. This is The Guardian. The US has now accused Russia of cyber attack on the energy sector and imposes new sanctions. So in other words, they found malware and problems in there. The UK finance and power water sectors are on the highest alert for threats of Russian cyber reprisal. Is this business as usual peacetime? No, it's going on every day. There's a state actor not operating in accordance with the rules of war. After we did that study, I went on and looked at defence logistics because we were concerned about supply chains, and we found exactly the same problem on assumptions. When I was a deputy chief, I didn't think about this stuff. The loggies were taking care of all of that, nice bunch of folks. And I've asked senior loggies, how come I didn't understand? And they said, well, we used to tell you we'd fix it, and sort of you'd go away and we'd fix it. That's all right for reaction to reactive changes. But I realised I didn't understand probably one of the most important things for a military, and that's logistics. It's not built into a lot of, certainly, pilots' DNA. People were telling me at the time when I did the study, we don't need to worry about fuel security because we've got contracts with industry. Yep. So I went off and did 3 studies, which were one of the triggers for a Senate inquiry in 2015 into energy security, particularly fuels. And I asked the question, will market forces take care of it for us? I had the opportunity to meet with one of the CEOs of the 4 oil and fuel companies in Australia. I won't say who it was because it was a Chatham House discussion. There was only 4 of them. And I said to him, what do you think about energy security? So in the market, you guys have got the triggers on this. And he said, energy security is not my job. And about then I got a bit stunned. And he said, energy reliability for my customers and for my shareholders is my job. Energy security is not my job. So when you listen to the industry talk about this, they'll talk about reliability of supply, not security of supply. So I'll show 2 diagrams from the reports I did to give you a sense. This is a megalitres per month for fuel imported or oils imported and over time. The top red line shows the growth in energy consumption of liquid fuels for transport. The higher part of the graph is what we were importing directly as refined fuels, largely from Singapore at that time. And the middle part of the graph is what we refine from imported oil, and the bottom part is what we've been refining from Australian crude oil. The types of oil that we use in our refineries, 3 out of the 4 only use heavy crude. The resources are declining at a faster rate than what is being replenished by discovery. The point here is that we went from 60% imports in 2000 to 91% of imports for our transport energy as we passed 2013. What's not shown on here is the refining industry. Between 2012 and 2015, 3 of the 7 refineries we have closed down. So I went to the then Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism and said, how many refineries should we have? What's the minimum number we need for resilience? And the answer I got told was we don't need any because it's cheaper to import fuel. I said, hang on. A lot of other countries, you can start to look at Norway and a whole bunch of the other countries doing, they do have refineries even though they've got extensive stocks because there's a reason for this with the resilience. The other thing is when countries don't have a huge amount of stocks or got concerns, they start to put other measures in there to give them resilience in their supply chains. So this shows the number of days of fuel stocks that governments mandate their industries to hold. In Australia, it's 0. Look at Korea, Japan, look at Europe. This is back in 2014. If you're an EU member, you have to hold 61 days of imports. So it's an important part of your resilience, but fuel stocks alone aren't the answer because fuel flow is the answer. You need to assure a continuous supply of flow sufficient to keep critical societal functions, and in our case, military functions operating. So the other way you do it is you hold strategic reserves. And again, we're very consistent here in Australia. We have none. Look at the figures underneath there of what other countries are doing. ASEAN Plus 3 has been looking at a lot of stuff about fuel security in recent years. You look at what China's doing with its fuel security and Japan and other countries. What is it that we know that gives us so much confidence that we don't have to mandate stocks, we don't have to hold stocks, and we don't need a refining industry when we're at the end of a very long supply chain? If we have a major problem in the electricity or gas sectors, despite everything being left to the market, the government can intervene because the energy comes from Australia. If we have a problem in this sector, the government can't do anything because 91% of the energy comes from overseas. So, a bit of a challenge there. Whilst I was doing this, I had the opportunity to speak extensively with Dr. Greg Calvert. He's a DSTG scientist who was the 2014 Secretary of Defence Fellow, and his studies were into fuel security. Just give me a sense. Who's read his reports? Ooh, I can't see anybody. Okay. He makes a whole bunch of really interesting points. He talked about the shift of fuel product sourcing. We used to source most of our product from Singapore, but it's now shifted up into the Northeast Asia region, from South Korea, from Japan. I think in the last year or two, we were importing 25% of our refined aviation fuel straight from China. He raises the point about nationalisation of oil supply companies in the region. So we're not dealing with companies now, we're now dealing with governments who are supplying us fuel from the area. And he raised the point of the rise of tensions in the South China Sea. More than half of all our refined fuel products are coming straight through the South China Sea. The concern he also highlighted, the dependence of Asia on the Middle East and North Africa crude for everything they do, and the emergence of strategic weapon systems in that area and what that means for our security of supply. Again, in the last week, Saudi Arabia announcing that if Iran goes and gets nuclear weapons, they're going to go and get them as well. Just have a think of what that could do to some of the security of supply. He talked about the closure of refineries in Australia, the growing fragility of our oil and fuel supply chain, and a decline in relative financial power. Projecting to the next decade, where you have supply shortages, what's your relative economic power to get those supplies when there's a competition? If there is a problem, are the countries who are holding strategic stock holdings going to release them to us? Why would they, if we've been dumb enough not to hold any stocks ourselves? His bottom line is this: we're in a strategic warning period for fuel security. So this is a diagram I presented to the Senate committee when we were talking about fuels. Now, energy, of course, is much bigger than this. So I said, look, we have a very poor energy security assessment. It's way out of date. There are zero government-owned fuel stocks in a strategic sense. I'm not talking about training stocks that Defence has. And there's zero mandated fuel stocks. We're 100% reliant on the market, and there is no plan B. If there's a market failure, we're stuffed. And the IEA's just said that, so it's not just me as a lunatic saying it. So what's happened is we've actually passed the responsibility to industry. At the Senate inquiry, the oil and fuel industry representative said this: national security scenarios are not appropriate for fuel supply security assessments. And the senators were fairly stunned. If we applied this in the military, we would never buy a JSF, because all we'd do is look at the last 10 or 15 years operating against terrorists, and we'd go off and buy something to operate against terrorists. But we are buying a very capable system in this country in defence. But we're not thinking about that in terms of energy security. They also said, and this is what surprised me, it's not the role of fuel distributors to hold buffer stocks. That's the role of the industry fuel users. And that amazed me. I thought, hang on, surely you should if the government says you hold stocks. No, that's not the case. The West Australian government, for example, now state governments are the first line of responders to fuel supply interruption. It's their responsibility. The federal government can step in later if they have to, but there won't be anything left to step in on. But the West Australian government, for example, in its 2016 disruption report says, look, the fuel supply system is really good, but it could get disrupted. That's beyond the state government's control, and what they recommend is that individuals, businesses, companies and agencies work out what their fuel needs would be in the event of a supply disruption and take appropriate measures to get fuel. So the reason one of the politicians came to me is I think one of his constituents went to him with my reports and said, what should I do? What are you going to tell some pensioner who says, what am I supposed to do with fuel stocks? Please do not do what a UK minister did in 2012, when well-meaning suggested, in the event I think it was a fuel tanker driver strike, go and get some jerry cans and put fuel in it and put it in your garage. Well, some poor lady in York, and this is true, I've chased it down enough times, some poor lady in York was decanting one of these jerry cans in the kitchen to get some fuel for her daughter's car, and she had the gas stove on. 40% burnt. So what I've said to politicians is, please don't tell people to go and stock fuel at home. But that's what the West Australian government report says now. So when you pass it to the users, the industry also said most users don't hold stocks because they think they're being held for them by government or industry, or else they think they're going to be preferred users. So in essence, the big users have passed the buck straight back up to government. So when I showed this to the senators, I said, Monty Python couldn't write this script. It's real. So what's the vector as a result of that? The first recommendation of the Senate inquiry was we have to do a comprehensive whole-of-government risk assessment of our fuel supply availability and vulnerability. Now, I'd argue we should look at energy as a whole. The last NESA was done by economists. Now, I'm not having a go at economists. but energy security is too important to leave to economists. You've got to have a mixed diversity, and you need people with an understanding of security involved in the discussion. Last week, the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, reviewing our critical infrastructure bill, made this recommendation. They've said the Department of Home Affairs, in consultation with Defence and the Department of Environment and Energy, need to review and develop measures to ensure Australia has a continuous supply of fuel to meet its national security priorities. I think we've got a challenge, a bit of a problem here. So, where are we now? If you accept that the government of people of Australia expect defence to operate not just when the markets are hunky-dory but there's a problem, then we've got a few issues. Our analysis of our resilience is poor, operational risks are high, energy security has been outsourced to the market and they don't want that job, and the IEA says we've got a problem. So where's the upside? So now I'm going to get optimistic at the end. Is there something that we in defence, and the type of thinking that's happened with defence in recent years, and I'll refer to Plan Jericho here, and some of the work that's happening in the VCDF area on integrated force design, is there something that defence can bring to this discussion of energy security in this country? So I'm going to use the artificial construct of generations of capability. So we talk about the JSF as a 5th generation fighter and the F-18 is a 4th generation. Well, I had the opportunity in the reserve to work on Plan Jericho for 2 years, supporting Air Commodores Chipman and Campbell, who I think are here today. And it was interesting. This wasn't just about buying more 5th gen platforms. It was about using that transformational opportunity of a 5th gen technology to actually integrate the 4th gen platforms in a different way, to improve their capability, and then in turn to amplify the capability of the 5th gen as well. It was a change in thinking. It was about integration, not just the platform level of stepping above it. We did realise early on, however, that if you just did it for Air Force, that doesn't make sense. It really has to be a part of a 5th generation integrated force. And again, as a reservist, I've had the opportunity to support some of the VCDF folks working on that in the last 2 years. It's about integrated design. It's about a cultural shift away from the platform to thinking about the system level. There's a lot of good lessons that came out of this. Could we apply some of that integrated thinking to the energy sector? Well, again, I'm going to use that construct to describe energy. It's artificial, but still. I think biomass is Gen 1. The vast majority of human history has been biomass energy. I'd call coal Gen 2, about the 18th century. Oil and gas Gen 3, 19th, 20th century. And I'd call nuclear and renewables, even the latest technologies, Gen 4. Why? Because it's being acquired and fielded the same way we were doing Gen 4 platforms. You buy all the technology pieces and you hope that something will integrate them together. Oh, Link 16 will solve our problems. Not in a 5th gen environment, it won't. And what we're doing today is we're building energy in pieces, not as a design system. So the question is can we, and again I'll use the corny term, should we talk about a 5th generation integrated energy system? Could we take that design thinking, change the thinking about it and push it there, and will the market provide for that? 2 weeks ago I sat in a very interesting meeting in Sydney between some advanced energy technology people and investment bankers. And I appreciate that people think defence is very hard to deal with because they can't understand acronyms and how we think. But I've got to tell you, investment bankers have got it all over us. So I asked them that when you're looking at investing in this new technology, what value do you put on the benefit to the security of the system, the resilience of the energy system, when you make that investment of huge amounts of money? And the answer is we don't. We're interested in the return on investment we get for that piece of energy. Can I make money from that? And we'll look at the cyber security of the system we're going to put on the ground. The bigger picture of the other things is not our job. That's the government's job, and they need to create the market incentives and directions and regulations to make it happen. Can you see a common theme here? This idea of an integrated energy approach is explored quite well, I think, in this ASPE report from last August, Colonel Neil Greet and Dr. Paul Barnes. And again, if you're interested in this area, go and have a look at it. It talks about how do you get resilience in our energy system in Australia, and it's not just fuels, it's a much bigger picture. I'm going to give you an example to finish off of what I think a 5th generation energy could be. So, here are the 2 points that come out of this report that I think is worthwhile looking at. We're fragmented and stovepiped. The example that I want to give is solar and wind. Despite having the highest deployment of solar on domestic houses in the world, apparently, solar and wind are about 1% each of our energy supplies. The trouble is they can sometimes provide more energy than you can use, and so it's dumped. In some cases, our infrastructure can't handle the amount of energy they can produce to move it across the country. In other cases, it doesn't produce it when you need it. So is there some way of integrating energy to do something different? I think it's hydrogen as an example. From the excess energy, you can produce hydrogen with the latest electrolyzers and you can store it. What we're talking about here is doing a time and mode shift. So, yeah, you can produce hydrogen and sell it. That's fourth gen. Could we use this in a different way? Yes, we can. You can use it for power generation, hydrogen gas turbines. You can produce ammonia, which is both essential in Australia as a fertiliser source, but also you've got engines can use ammonia now. You can pump it into gas systems, that's being talked about in South Australia, to amplify or to expand the amount of gas we're using. You can create gas from it. You can use it for transport with the new generation fuel cells. The first hydrogen cars will be on the market in Australia this year. The US military is already testing army vehicles based on hydrogen. And you can export it. The Japanese government has a large plan, a significant plan, to use hydrogen, green-sourced hydrogen eventually, as a part of their energy system. There's going to be a huge export market. The analysis here in Australia is that could equal our liquid natural gas exports. That's large. And our advantage here is our solar footprint compared to most other countries. You can use all that, but you can do it at different scales. In Italy, 2 years ago, I saw a small system that used hydrogen, solar and batteries between 1 kilowatts or 10 kilowatts for emergency services, HADR and also military. So imagine deploying to an area where you can actually generate in area your energy and store it and use it in different ways, rather than have the fuel come from the Middle East, go to some refinery in Asia, then come back through a long supply chain and all the risks associated with it. I'm not kidding myself, so I'm not going to fly in JSF on hydrogen, but if we can look at our energy supply chains in a different way and reduce some of that vulnerability, then we should do it. We can also apply it here. The only way to store hydro and solar at scale is pumped hydro. So wind and solar at scale is pumped hydro. That's going to take ages to get to. We now need to look in Australia at producing regional or sub-regional networks or meshes using these types of energy integrators to amplify and make more resilient what's there. It's about integration, resilience, economics, energy security and scalability. Will the thinking about this design emerge from within the industry? I can tell you my view is no. Where the opportunity is, defence can argue on the basis of national security that an integrated approach to capabilities, a fifth gen if you want to use that term, could be applied to the energy market, which will benefit us significantly. So, bottom line is, a fifth gen force, which is what we're building, can run on a third and fourth generation energy system, but at a cost and risk premium. Our energy security is fragile, and we can't let that continue. I think a fifth gen force needs a fifth gen energy system, and that's not just a military issue, it's a national approach. Defensive uses of energy has evolved, it needs to transform. We must have an energy strategy and policy. If we don't, we're going to run around doing really nice innovative bits. And yeah, we applaud Jericho's doing this bottom-up innovation, but I've got to tell you what, there's a concept and a vector. It's being led somewhere. There's a framework. We don't have that nationally. Defence has to be a part of the national energy system design process because it's a part of national security. We have to lead, not just follow. If a retired pensioner like me can stir up a Senate inquiry and have these issues, imagine what defence leadership can do if it stands up and says, we've got a national security problem, we've got a model that we've used for military capability, we think it can be applied to this, let us be a part of the discussion. So, otherwise, this magnificent aeroplane, in all its glory, will be about as useful as that. It won't look anywhere as good on their show. So, here's the bottom line. National security depends on energy security. We have to lead, not just follow, and I'm calling on defence leadership to actually do that. It's our responsibility. That's why, as a retired pensioner, I'm doing this. I think it's important for a lot of poor people to do it. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to questions afterwards. Bye.